been watching these videos with the Circle, Dave, and I want to say that sometimes they can get a little sloppy. And it's obviously because, it's a lot on them. It's a lot. And Paul probably paid a lot of money to go for the show. And for just to be okay, I disagree with that. Also, if I was going, I would have happily gone a couple of nights. And I disagree with the couple on the plane. I'll tell you why. Because I heard the Q&A on the Thursday because they did the Sirius XM special from that. And I saw the Friday night show. We'll get into this in another letter with Midwest Ron. If you guys remember, on the last podcast, I talked about live stream that Sam did, which was great. But Midwest Ron had told us that that was taped on the Friday night. So actually, the broadcast that I saw on the Saturday night was actually Friday night show, and we're going to tell you why in a little bit. But the Friday night show was apparently hot. The Thursday night was a casual hang sound check kind of thing. And unfortunately, Paul, I'm sure by the time he got to Saturday, they might have been a little pooped out. But the chances of him playing Swept Away and Boys Night Out, I'm not really sure, though he has been deep in his catalog. So you never know. He may pull it out during one of the residencies, and I know he's doing more of a residency at the Strat coming in 2022. He hasn't announced it yet, but he did say he's coming back to do more. And I'm glad to hear that the canned cocktails are tasty, but unfortunately, we can't get them here on the East Coast yet. So what do you make of Vegas Paul Davis, Dave?
Well, thanks for the review, Paul. Always like hearing from you. I guess I'm not too surprised that they can be sloppy because Sam does not like to rehearse too much.
Yep, that's
number
true.
one.
Very true.
And number two, a lot of these songs are not songs that they've been doing often. So if they're not going to really practice them, they're going to come off a little sloppy, a little off. But Sam likes that. He doesn't want it to be too rehearsed. So that's the approach.
He likes it loosey-goosey. That's his thing.
Yeah.
Letter number 2, Dave, comes from Sarah Smythe from the UK. And she says, I finally believe I've got to the bottom of what actually really happened with Van Halen Split in 85. And she says he took a screenshot of the explanation. And I know that there has to be more here about the split than what the public knows. Now, what this screenshot that she had, and I just read a clip of it because it was long, but it said here that Ted Templeman played Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth against each other. This is what the person who explained this, I don't know who this is, but whoever she took this shot from. And when Ted Templeman pushed his conflicting ideas onto the band, Eddie Van Halen was the most assertive, pushing back at Templeman, refusing Van Halen to be anything but the hardest guitar-driven rock and roll on the planet. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, Templeman thought. But he basically put his hooks into David Lee Roth, befriended him, stroking his ego, convincing him the band is nothing without him. He should be the star. He doesn't need them. All of Templeman's own personal financial gain was at David Lee Roth's expense, of course, because Ted Templeman would dump Van Halen and produce a David Lee Roth band. And the boys, primarily Ed, felt betrayed and that David Lee Roth was tempted by the dark side and succumbed. So what Sarah says here, there was a lot going on behind the scenes at Warner Brothers with contracts and agreements. I never thought Templeman was behind it all. He ruined David Lee Roth's career for his own personal gain. Remember that Templeman leaves Van Halen with David Lee Roth and 60 members of the crew. This could only have been made possible if arranged and agreed with the employer, Warner Brothers. Remember that Eddie Van Halen built 5150 Studios by 1983 and created all the songs for the 1984 album there with Don Landy. This was the band's most successful album due to no cover songs, and Ted Templeman loved the cover songs, and he knew his days of working with Eddie Van Halen were over, and he was soon to be out of a job, so he worked with Roth early on, and I believe the film deal with CBS was part of the deal, and Roth got scammed and it ended his career because he trusted Templeman and was naive in thinking he had his best interests at heart. Sarah Smythe from the UK. Wow, Sarah. Talk about a powerful letter there. You're taking all kinds of swings. But listen, I agree to a certain extent. I don't think Ted was as sinister in that way, but I do think he meddled. And I think a lot of the reason why he wrote that book is because he could set a narrative as to what actually happened behind the scenes. Because I think he wasn't exactly truthful in that book. Nothing against Greg Renoff, because Greg wrote what Ted told him. I mean, he's not going to start changing things from what Ted is telling him. It's Ted's book. Greg was writing it, but it was Ted's story. What I really think, and I've said this before on the podcast, is that Templeman saw His relationship with Ed was going south. His relationship with Don Landy was going south. So that is a major, major break. I don't think he was like stroking Dave and coasting him. I really think he saw the break happening. He's on one side with Dave. Eddie's on the other side with Don. Obviously, Al always goes with Eddie, and Mike is Switzerland. So I really think there was some brokering behind the scenes and that there would be kind of almost two Van Halens in a way. You get 2 for 1 type of deal. I think he did some sort of executive type of thing there because he really lost control of the group, and I think it angered him. I think he was mad at Eddie. I think he was mad at Don Landy. I'm convinced that there were backroom deals made. You'll never know the truth about this, that's for sure. Remember, he's a Warner Brothers executive as well as a producer, so keep in mind also, notice that David Lee Roth's albums without Ted Templeman weren't as supported by the record company as they were when Ted Templeman was in them. So you remember, Crazy from the Heat, completely promoted, blasted everywhere, did well, successful. Same thing with Eat 'Em and Smile. But when it came to Skyscraper and A Little Ain't Enough and Your Filthy Little Mouth, he got less and less support from the record company. I wonder why.
I don't think he got less support for Skyscraper.
Well,
I mean, my God, he was on the side of Tower Records for crying out loud.
I understand that, but I don't think they worked that album the way they worked the other two. But whatever. And I also think it's interesting. I think it's also very interesting. It's at that point where Ted comes in and starts working with Van Halen after Dave fired him. Remember, he said he was all set to produce Skyscraper, and then Dave did that whole thing where he fired Ted. And then all of a sudden, Ted's working on the For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge album. I thought that was really, really strange. And all of a sudden, Van Halen's Fuck album, during a difficult year for rock and roll, 1991, they did well. And I think they had a lot of record company support on that album. That was a critical album for Van Hagar. And that ship went in the right direction. There's a lot of good albums in 91 that just didn't get the support. It's not that the quality wasn't there. There's a lot of good albums. In fact, Eddie Trunk was talking about this the other day. There were so many albums that came out that were great albums, but they didn't have the record company support because it all went to, Nirvana, and then the whole grunge thing happened, and the record company kind of lost interest. Van Halen survived no problem. In fact, they did, and they thrived. I don't know. There's something funny there. What do you think?
I didn't realize we were at the conspiracy portion of the show.
We're starting early.
So here we go.
Here we go.
First of all, again, I don't think Ted Templeman is going to put one of the biggest acts of the record company at risk by splitting them in two.
But Dave, if they're already breaking apart, it only makes...
but he's not going to actively try and promote to break them up. And the other thing is, he was always a fan of Eddie's. And that was the reason why the band was signed. And the weak link he saw in the band was David Lee Roth. So you're telling me that Ted Templeman is going to sign with who he thinks is the weakest link of the band and join him and not stick with who he thinks is the strongest link in the band, which is Ed. That just doesn't make any sense.
Well, I'll tell you how it makes sense to me. Can I explain that? This is how it makes sense to me. I think he knew that Ed would be fine because Ed is a musical genius. He had Don Landy to help him in the studio, and he was like, Ed is good. Dave is going to need my attention. And they built a fantastic band around Dave and a whole promotional thing behind Eat 'Em and Smile, everything. Come on. One thing that really is telling here that no one talks about is the absolute support and money and budget that Dave got for doing Crazy from the Heat. I mean, it is unbelievable. Now, look, we all know. I mean, everybody's done little side projects. Look, Eddie did Starfleet Project, all this kind of stuff. It's like a little EP on the side. Okay, no problem. Like a little fun little thing. That Crazy from the Heat thing was so promoted. My God. I mean, 2 massive videos on MTV, the Letterman appearance, the cover of Rolling Stone. I mean, it was unbelievable what they did with that EP. I couldn't believe it. Even as a kid, I couldn't believe it. I remember going into record stores and massive displays just for that EP. That tells you something. That, in my opinion, is one of the biggest keys of the whole thing that's overlooked. Because, wow, how the fuck
Well, he was the lead singer of one of the biggest bands at the time. Are you really that surprised they're not going to promote the hell out of it?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. Because, God, he wasn't doing rock music. I mean, if you look back at what that was, if you read it on paper, okay, you got this big rock band.
I understand. I understand that musically it doesn't make sense that it did as well as it did.
Right.
But somehow it did.
Right.
And yeah, and maybe that's why they gave it the push they did, because they were like, oh, Dave's doing like the side project thing, and it really is a side project. He's doing his own thing. I think we need to push this as much as possible, because without it, it's just really not going to do well, and we're going to take a bath on it.
Well, I can't imagine it was too expensive to make, number one. But let me tell you something, what is expensive?
Not too expensive to make. They had all sorts of expensive people playing on that album. I mean, they had a Beach Boy on the album. They had Edgar Winter on that album.
Which just goes to show you there was budget. There was budget for that project. I'm telling you that.
Of course there was budget. David Lee Roth was putting out a side project. He was in one of the biggest bands of the time. Of course they're going to give him money for a side project.
You don't think that's fanning the flames?
Of splitting the band up?
Yes.
Well, it could be. I won't say definitively that it wasn't. If you want to say that Ted Templeman is trying to control the narrative by saying, well, let's just have Dave do it, get it out of his system, and then he can go back to Van Halen. We can do that, and we can say that. But by the way, Dave was also saying the same thing. He had every intent of going back to the band.
Yeah, I'm not doubting that. But how do you not completely fucking piss off the whole band by giving Dave the machine behind him? I mean, Van Halen had never been on Letterman like that. Van Halen had never been on the cover of Rolling Stone. And, I mean, it was like unbelievable. Dave is hosting shows on MTV with Martha Quinn. I mean, by himself, like he was getting.
But it is always easier to get one person to do something than four. And Ed in particular was not a big fan of doing any of that stuff. Whereas Dave, you can't even finish the sentence and get it out of your mouth. And he's already running on stage to do whatever interview or hosting gig he's got to do next.
There's just something there. I don't know what it is, but there's something very, very fishy about that moment. You remember when you read it in Noel's book when he's talking about how Dave casually mentions it when they're on the plane, and it's like, how the fuck does the lead singer of the band, the producer of the band, and the record company from the band are all working behind the scenes on this massive project that the band doesn't know about? That to me is impossible.
Could be, but then again, you know what you want to know. And Ed wasn't exactly paying attention to a lot of things outside of his own world. The fact that Ed didn't know doesn't surprise me at all. He just does what he does. He plays guitar with his brother at 5150, and that's what he does.
Well, I don't know. I guess I'm giving Ed too much credit there. I don't know. Anyway, on to letter number 3. Comes from David Roberts, and he says, I recently remembered this moderately humorous story regarding Gary Cherone. He's in college, and he got a chance to interview him for his college radio station promoting the Tribe of Judah album, and he asked him many questions about Halen and his amazing performance at the Freddie Mercury tribute concert when he was with Extreme. He says, I said something to the effect of how those were the big peak moments in his career, and he responded, yes, but the biggest highlight was being spoofed by Weird Al. That comes from David Roberts. I want to say Gary likes to use humor very often to fend off questions about Van Halen or whatever he doesn't want to talk about, because I've interviewed Gary and he's done that. However, I want to say that Weird Al spoofing you was the biggest mark of success back in the day, right, Dave?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and Gary's not the only artist to say that. There's been other artists I forget who said it, but I forget which artist it was, but somebody had said they knew they had made it big when they got spoofed by Weird Al. It may have been Kurt Cobain, but I could be getting that wrong. But anyway,
right.
I mean, he's been doing this for like 30, 40 years, so when he spoofs one of your songs, it's like, all right, I made the big time. Weird Al, went through the trouble of spoofing one of my songs.
Right, exactly. So that's cool. Letter number 4, Dave, comes from Andrew Bonamore. And he says here, I've always really enjoyed your podcast. It's by far more interesting than similar music podcasts, but you guys keep the flow going, augmented by the chemistry the two of you have. He says DLR's retirement statement was very interesting. When he speaks, he refers to him and Alex as the original lineup of Van Halen, but there's no mention of Mike. And even when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, the